Okay. Last stream of the week. Here we go. Friday, final session. If it's your first time or if you're watching this after the event, my name's Rafe Beckley. It's also Piers Ryman. I narrate as both. I'm narrating as Rafe Beckley at the moment. You can sit in the studio with me live now or watch this over the weekend, actually, because I don't pull them down until the next studio session happens, and that's Monday. I will be recording What's and All, so you can watch and listen along. I've shared my screen with you. You'll see if it's your first time, we have the text that I'm narrating here, which is a Pride and Prejudice variation called The Wrong Brother by Harriet Knowles. Over here on the left bottom, you will see my recording software. And just above that is also the recording software. That's the bit above it is the bit that keeps track of my character voices. So I have samples every time I come across a new character so that I can keep characters consistent across chapters and across books. Obviously, if you like it, like, subscribe, do all the tappy stuff that you're supposed to do, and you can drop in any time I'm on. I go live 5 days a week. Monday to Friday, generally speaking, 1 o'clock UK time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon European time, and 8 a.m. Eastern Standard. That's about it, really. On that, let's just get recording. I want to get a couple of chapters at least, ideally, before I break for the weekend. A weekend of do-it-yourself, because the place is covered in plasterboard chic at the moment, and it has been for years, and I've really got to do something about it. And a little bit of gardening and moving about physically, because I have such a sedentary job. Okay, away we go. Chapter 22. Elizabeth was playing to Jane and her aunt in the drawing-room. She was playing quiet, calm music, trying to soothe Jane's obvious anxiety. Elizabeth didn't know why her sister was worried. It was obvious Mr. Bingley would call again this morning. Her own dismay that Mr. Darcy wouldn't call had faded somewhat. She knew he had been very seriously injured, but that he had not yet been able to leave his quarters. After so many weeks, she had been shocked when Mr. Bingley had disclosed the fact. She ought not to have been so surprised. If he had been as near death as had been reported, he might never recover fully. She had just started mournfully playing one of Haydn's sonatas when she heard the doorbell and smiled to herself. At least Mr. Bingley was prompt, and Jane would not have time to become more anxious. The door opened, and the housekeeper stood in the doorway. "The Earl of Falmouth, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and Mr. Bingley," she announced, and Elizabeth's hands stilled in the middle of the piece. She rose to her feet with the other ladies and waited for the gentleman to enter the room. But she could only look at Mr. Darcy. No, she berated herself, Lord Falmouth. She must not get his name wrong. And Colonel Fitzwilliam was here too. He must have told Mr. Darcy that she'd called on Georgiana. Georgiana! Her face flamed with mortification, and she wished herself safely in her bedchamber. She watched him as he entered. His glance sought her out, although he had to give his attention to Aunt Gardiner, of course. He was fully attired, very properly, in the same uniform as his cousin, but she thought he didn't look well. His complexion was greyer than it had been in Hertfordshire, and he held his arm stiffly into his side. Lines etched in his face showed he was still in pain. His bow was a little less deep than Mr. Bingley's usual extravagant one. Ooh, should have breathed more there. His bow was a little less deep than Mr. Bingley's usual extravagant one and his cousin's neat bow, but her aunt was smiling graciously. "It is very good of you to It is very good of you to call, gentlemen." She turned to Mr. Darcy. "I wonder which seat will be the easiest to rise from despite your wound, Lord Falmouth." Elizabeth was pleased. Aunt knew just the right thing to say. and she retook her seat on the piano stool, hoping she might remain out of the main conversation. How would she ever be able to indicate... How would she ever be able to indicate to him that she had no designs on him, that she hadn't known of his elevation before she called on Georgiana? "Please do not be concerned, Mrs. Gardiner. I can marry... Please do not be concerned, Mrs. Gardiner. I can manage very well." His voice was deeply comforting to Elizabeth, who had quite thought she might never hear it again. She berated, "It was just loose. That was loose." Okay. His voice was deeply comforting to Elizabeth, who had quite thought she might never hear it again. She berated herself again. She must have no expectations. It was not possible that she could harbour any hopes at all. She was entirely without fortune and without connections. He might be a second son, but he came from the highest society. She'd seen it for herself at Matlock House, and he was now an earl. And Colonel Fitzwilliam would have told him of her call there. Then she saw a shadow near her. "Miss Elizabeth." His voice was quiet. "May I sit with you?" She glanced up, surprised. He looked a little uneasy. "I was pleased to hear you playing before we came into the room. It seems a long time since I had the pleasure of listening to music. The officers' quarters are very quiet. Might you play a little?" "Of course, my lord." She was glad to have remembered to address him correctly, although she saw a momentary distaste cross his face. But she'd already turned to the pianoforte. The instrument was nothing like as fine as the one... There's no that. The instrument was nothing like as fine as the one she'd seen at Matlock House, but to do it justice, it was a great deal better than the battered old upright at Longbourn. The sonata she'd been playing was suitable, and she didn't need the music, so she commenced playing it again, quietly enough to allow the rest of the party to make conversation. He sat silently beside her, and slowly her mortification receded. Perhaps that had been his intention. With the music, the silence was quite companionable. But as the piece drew to a close, he spoke. "You play beautifully, Miss Elizabeth." "Thank you, I enjoy it." He smiled slightly. "But perhaps you would appreciate some refreshment. May I bring you some tea?" Her head jerked up. "Mr. Darcy, please do not consider it. Oh," she exclaimed, "I apologize. I must remember to address you properly." His smile was strained. "I confess I prefer to be addressed as Mr. Darcy." She laughed lightly. "I'm sure you will soon become used to it. Let me fetch tea." "Let me fetch tea for us both." She rose to her feet and soon returned to the pianoforte. She glanced back at her aunt. "I think Colonel Fitzwilliam is doing sterling work in entertaining my aunt," she remarked, moving the small table to his right side so he could reach his cup more easily. He huffed a quiet laugh. "He was charged with doing so. I... He was charged. He was... Yeah, we probably do a bit better. That's a bit much." "He was charged with doing so. I hope your aunt has not discerned the real reason. Come on." "He was charged with doing so. I hope your aunt has not discerned the reason." Elizabeth's heart was performing peculiarly, and she fought to control her emotions. "Please do not... Please do not harbour any misapprehension, Mr. Darcy. Aunt Gardiner is a very astute lady. She has undoubtedly understood the situation, and has approved it, or she would have summoned Jane and me to the big sofa. To the big sofa? That's not what it says. Or she would have summoned Jane and me to the sofa for more general conversation." He looked slightly alarmed. "Do you think so?" She nodded her head. "I know it to be true." "Well, I must bow to your greater knowledge of the lady, but I pray you do not disabuse my cousin of his hope that she is unaware." She laughed again. "I will not, if he prefers to think it." She glanced at him. "I understand he must have told you of... Uh, I understand he must have, not she. I understand he must have told you of my call upon your sister." He looked slightly concerned, but she knew he would wish to talk about it, and she'd wondered if he felt he could not begin the conversation. The conversation, that's awful. And she'd wondered if he felt he could not begin the conversation. He looked at her. "He did. I was dismayed to find out you had not left any indication of where you were staying in London." His smile was twisted. "We could not imagine how to discover it and call upon you." Burps. Elizabeth felt embarrassment heat her face, and she bent her head. "I was glad of it when I got home afterwards and Jane showed me the Gazette." She raised her eyes and met his. "I was mortified to think your cousin would think I was a fortune or title hunter. It was wrong of me to call on your sister, especially as I had quite forgotten quite, not quite forgotten. Especially as I had forgotten quite how young you had said she was. I hope she was not distressed by my call." His slow smile reassured her. "Not at all. She is so shy it was very unusual for her to suggest you might call again. But as for the other matter, the family would indeed have thought of the coincidence of the timing of your call. If my cousin had not heard Bingley mention your family name that very morning, you may not have been admitted." He shifted uncomfortably in the chair. "But he wanted to see what you would say. We were not inclined to suspect you." Elizabeth sipped her tea. It seemed she was going to be forgiven her forwardness in going uninvited to see Georgiana. "I am grateful that you have not censured me for my rudeness in calling on her uninvited," she said. "My sister needed some time." Something struck her. "One moment. Did you say Colonel Fitzwilliam had heard Mr. Bingley mention the Bennet name in the morning?" He nodded. "Yes, so he was interested to observe you when you called." "But Mr. Bingley was at Netherfield. He said he called at Longbourn and was redirected here." Elizabeth tried to puzzle through what had happened. Mr. Darcy's chuckle sent a wave of warmth cascading through her. "I confess Mr. Bingley was in London. In order to... Okay, and I can pick it from there. It's fine. Uh, just need to do that. That's better. You know... Oh, no. In order to discover where you and your sister are staying, he rode down to Hertfordshire at dawn yesterday and was just in time to call formally at Longbourn. After he had obtained the information, he rode back immediately and, I believe, called on your sister here, still tired from the journey." Elizabeth could hardly believe it, except that she knew Mr. Bingley held Jane in the highest regard. She looked over at the other couple. "I think I will have to tell her. She will be very honoured that he cared so much to do that in order to find her." He smiled. "I understand you are returning home for Christmas, Miss Elizabeth." Okay. "I understand you are returning home for Christmas, Miss Elizabeth." "Yes, we are. And Uncle and Aunt Gardiner are coming too. We will be a merry party." As a result of learning that, Bingley has, of course, decided to return to Nether. Sloppy, sloppy. As a result of learning that, Bingley has, of course, decided to return to Netherfield for the duration," he said. He seemed to hesitate. "The surgeons have recommended I go into the country until my wounds have healed properly, so my cousin and I will be joining him." He met her eyes. "I would like to ask my sister to accompany me. I I would like to ask my sister to accompany me. I think she is desirous of continuing her friendship with you. Okay, quick sip of the juice, and on we go. Chapter 23. Darcy was buoyed up and satisfied as they drove back to the barracks after their call. You look... You look content with the call, Darcy? Richard observed him from his seat opposite. Darcy nodded. It was good of you to keep the aunt in conversation, so Bingley and I could have a moment with the young ladies. I agree. Bingley had a smug, not Smaug smile, that's a different book. Bingley had a smug smile on his face, an expression which Bingley had a smug smile on his face, an expression which Darcy devoutly hoped was not on his own features too. She is a good conversationalist, Richard shrugged. Very easy to keep her distracted from what was going on. You, too, are skilled in being sociable. Not for anything would Darcy inform his cousin that Mrs. Gardiner had discerned his ruse and assisted him. I would be happier if your contentment allowed you to do... Whoop. I would be happier if you... trod all over my cue. Probably means I need to trim that back a bit. I would be happier if your contentment allowed you to enjoy this afternoon and rest. What is going on? Friday. I would be happier if your contentment allowed you to enjoy this afternoon and rest. Richard glanced over. It is a pity you must take the road again today. Darcy nodded gloomily. I had hoped I need not... Right. Numbers. Let's get these articulators working properly. Here we go. It's the same as doing that does the same thing as a couple of tongue twisters. It just gets the articulators going a little bit further. I had hoped I need not be reminded of it until after lunch. Bingley frowned. Where do you have to go, Darcy? I think you should rest, as you haven't been out and about before. I would like nothing better. Darcy rubbed his face. It is why I have not gone out for a drive much sooner to relieve the boredom. Boredom? It is why I have not gone out for a drive much sooner to relieve the boredom. But now I have been seen out, it will be politic to go at once and wait upon the prince. He will be displeased enough that he was not my first call. Bingley grimaced. Perhaps you ought to have gone there first. It was my intention, until the opportunity arose to go to Cheapside this morning. Perhaps he will not have been told by his flatterers, but I must go after lunch. Borrow my coach, if you wish. I think you ought not to walk so far. Thank you. I will accept it, even though it is not what I would ever have called far. Darcy shook his head glumly. He was still abominably weak. Richard seemed to know his feelings. Has the surgeon said how long it will be before you are feeling better? Darcy shook his head. No, just that it will take many months. He scowled. It cannot take that long. I must find a way of working to make it sooner. Well, this is Bingley, sorry. Well, I will instruct my cook to ensure there is plenty of good food on the table these next weeks, Darcy. Bingley looked complacent. I think you need to build yourself up and eat well. Perhaps. Darcy steeled himself as the coach turned into the parade ground. The discomfort was still acute when he had to move. He had hidden it for the duration of the call, and now he was tired. However, Perhaps it would be as... However, perhaps it would be as well if... However, perhaps it would be as well if he did not look his usual self for his call upon the prince. He did not want to be recalled before going into the country. At Carlton House, he stood waiting to be admitted. He frowned and brushed a white thread from his sleeve. The surgeon had been waiting at their quarters and had berated him for not wearing the sling he had provided. So Darcy had worn it when setting off in Bingley's coach this afternoon, but he had removed it before arriving to seek audience with the prince. Was not inclined to seem to be seeking sympathy. He hoped this thread was the only one from it. The great double doors opened, and several gaudily dressed footmen appeared. The tallest of them stepped forward and bowed. "This way, if you please, Lord Falmouth." His muscles tightened. He must not forget to thank the regent for his ennoblement. He must not forget to thank the regent for his ennoblement, whatever his own resentment. His lips curved. Miss Elizabeth Bennet hadn't mentioned it after he had. Miss Elizabeth Bennet hadn't mentioned it after he had told her he'd prefer to be Mr. Darcy still, but he wondered what she'd think about being a countess. He entered the chamber and bowed deeply, clenching his jaw to prevent a grimace. The prince's eyes were sharp. "Right, where are you, Prinny?" Prince Regent. "Dear Sir Darcy, I was not expecting you here. This is the prince. He's here. Yes, lovely. Lots and lots of bottom teeth and a slight bit of cheek." Okay, here we go then. "I am glad to see you on your feet, Darcy." He slouched on his ornate chair, surrounded by lackeys and lickspittles, their beady eyes on him, missing nothing. Darcy did not want to be one of them. They were quite safe from him, though their suspicion was quite understandable. If they said the wrong thing, or omitted to say the right thing, they could be ejected from the prince's favour within an instant. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for giving me audience." Darcy resented bitterly the need to keep the prince's favour. "Well, come over here, then. Let me see you properly." The prince scowled at a servant. The Just... Yes, perfect. The prince scowled at a servant. "Get Darcy a chair, man, quickly." Darcy was surprised. The prince never permitted anyone to sit in his presence unless for a card game or something of the sort. Perhaps his own appearance was sufficiently poor to have provoked the prince's concern. He would never have thought the man capable of it. "I am grateful for your concern, sir, but I am able to stand if your highness prefers it." "Nonsense! Even though I prefer it, the surgeon has been to see me not an hour ago." His gaze was astute. "Why are you not using the sling he instructed you to wear?" Darcy hesitated. "I did not feel it appropriate to appear to be seeking sympathy, sir." A moment's silence. Then the prince roared with laughter. A further moment, and the rest of the sycophants around him joined in dutifully. Darcy kept his own expression impassive. What was the reason for the prince's amusement? "Do not look so wooden, Darcy." The prince wiped his eyes. "The surgeon has told me of your irascibility and refusal to behave appropriately to speed your recovery. Now sit me down and tell me why." Darcy crossed the room, rather wishing the chair was further away from the prince than it had been placed, knowing that he dared not reposition it. "I am not aware." No. "I am not aware the surgeon is thinking I am not wishing for a speedy recovery." he said carefully as he sat down. "My only objection is that he seems to believe I cannot do anything, whereas I feel somewhat better than that." The prince eyed him carefully. Darcy remembered himself. "I am oh, no, wrong one. I am grateful, though, for you accepting. I am grateful, though, for your accepting my call today. I wish to tender my humble gratitude for the honour you have bestowed upon me." Oh, watch those mouth corners. "I am grateful, though, for your accepting my call today. I wish to tender my humble gratitude for the honour you have bestowed upon me." He bowed slightly. "Well spoken, Darcy." The prince nodded at him. "He tells me he has recommended you rest in the country until your wound is fully healed." "Yes, sir." Darcy wondered what he would... Darcy wondered what he was... Oh, stamping on my cues. Don't do it. Darcy wondered what he was going to say. "Do you have somewhere to go which is Yep. Darcy wondered what he was going to say. "Do you have somewhere to go which is not too far from town?" "I have been invited to spend some time with a friend in Hertfordshire." "That is not too far." The prince nodded approvingly. "I might have need of you, and you must not travel too far away. Some roads would not be conducive to healing the wound." "If your highness wishes me to stay in... If your highness wishes me to stay in town, you have only to say..." He had better not. Darcy was almost ready to resign his commission if that happened, but he needed to know. The prince waved his hand. "I need the fittest, strongest, most alert guards around me. You are not yet fit, Darcy. Go to Hertfordshire, get yourself well. I intend to travel in the spring, and I will need you with me." "I would be honoured to serve you." Darcy bowed his head again. Serve him be damned. But he would take the time to plan how to so order his affairs. But he would take the time to plan how to so order. But he would take this time to plan how to so order his affairs that he could resign before being required to return. "Yes, yes." The prince lost interest. "Leave direction of how you may be contacted with your commander, then go at once." Darcy gripped his arm tightly to his side as Bingley's coach turned a corner he hadn't expected. He muttered an expletive, wondering if he could even undertake the journey to Netherfield. He leaned back against the cushions. Of course he would go. If Miss Elizabeth Bennet would be there, he needed to be in the country too. Perhaps it was just because today was his first day out. Once he reached the barracks, he hurried upstairs to his chambers, glad he didn't see Richard. He must rest and sweat this pain out. If the Miss Bennets were not going to Hertfordshire until Thursday, Bingley would not wish to leave the town until then. It gave him another day to recover, apart from the short ride to Cheapside in the morning, of course. He wished to call upon her there tomorrow. Okay. Chapter 23, set it up. File, save all the projects. Mm-hmm. Okay. Getting a bit warm in here now. I have to take my jumper off quickly. Take my jumper off quickly. Take 2 seconds. Yeah. There we go. Stay. Okay. All right then, on we go. Let's see what we've got next. Chapter 24. Elizabeth was playing again the next morning as the ladies sat in the drawing-room. Aunt Gardiner's face was untroubled, and Jane was certainly more composed than yesterday. Elizabeth had to acknowledge her contentment too. Mr. Darcy's appearance here yesterday seemed to tell her that he was interested in calling on her. He wouldn't have accompanied his friend just to disapprove of her sister being the object of Mr. Bingley. Oi, Bingley! He wouldn't have accompanied his friend just to disapprove of her sister being the object of Mr. Bingley's affection, not if it was his first call since his injury. Perhaps he knew of a way to make a living outside the army, knew of a way to be able to afford a family. She frowned and concentrated on the music. She must not be too hopeful, but she was pleased he would be staying with Mr. Bingley in the country when she went home. The ring at the doorbell raised her spirits somewhat, and she dropped her hands from the keys and turned in her seat, ready to stand and curtsy in greeting. "Mr. Bingley," announced the housekeeper, and Elizabeth's spirits... Elizabeth's spirits... I've got to separate those S's. And Elizabeth's spirits fell. Mr. Darcy had not come with him. They curtsied, and he bowed in return. His smile was as broad as ever, but his eyes were serious. "Good morning, Mrs. Gardiner. Thank you for accepting my call. We will take tea." Aunt Gardiner nodded at the housekeeper. "Excuse me." "Come and sit down, Mr. Bingley, and you can tell us how your friend is. I had supposed he might... I had supposed he might accompany you this morning." Elizabeth saw her glance sharply at her, and hoped her expression was tranquil enough. She hoped Mr. Bingley would explain. He did. Lord Falmouth, sends his regrets at not being able to call this morning, Mrs. Gardiner. Unfortunately, he found it necessary to call on the Prince Regent yesterday afternoon, and I think the effort may have been too much for him. Bingley looked everywhere except at Elizabeth. "He has been resting, with the intention of being well enough to travel into the country with me on Thursday, but the surgeon says he will not permit him to... But the surgeon says he will not permit him to go unless his fever settles." He frowned. "Darcy hadn't told me the wound had not yet fully healed, and he will not wear the sling." Elizabeth tried not to smile. "I think he would never wish to draw unwanted attention to himself, Mr. Bingley." She stayed at the pianoforte. Perhaps she could play quietly again today and avoid difficult questions from her aunt. It was not to be. While their guest spoke quietly to Jane, her aunt beckoned to Elizabeth. "Come and sit with me, Lizzie." She lowered her voice. "If we talk, then Jane and Mr. Bingley will have more of a semblance. If we talk, then Jane and Mr. Bingley will have more of a semblance of privacy." Elizabeth joined her, a little reluctantly. She didn't want her aunt asking about her feelings for Mr. Darcy, and she feared it might be the topic of conversation. "It is worrying that so long after the attack his wound hasn't healed." Aunt Gardiner spoke quietly. "It may be that he will not be fit to travel so far as Netherfield, or to a place where there is no doctor." She looked at Elizabeth. "Meryton only has an apothecary, does it not?" "Yes." Elizabeth was subdued. Her aunt was right, of course, but she was bitterly disappointed. Her aunt sighed. "I think Lord Falmouth will be determined to travel, though, and I doubt his cousin or Mr. Bingley will be able to dissuade him. He asked me to continue calling him Mr. Darcy." Elizabeth spoke as quietly as her aunt. "I gained the impression he is not pleased at his ennoblement." "Then he would be very unusual." Aunt Gardiner sipped her tea. "Such a title will materially improve his chances of marrying a woman with a good fortune." She glanced sharply at her niece. "I know that, aunt." Elizabeth looked down at her hands, glad they were folded in her lap. I know that as the second son he has no fortune." She looked up. "So why does he pay me such attention?" Her aunt's expression was sad. "How do you feel about it, Lizzie?" "I think you must know how I feel, even without me saying it out loud." Elizabeth sighed. "Even though I know it, I still—" Oh, she went a bit northern there. That's no good. I think... Oh, hold on. We've got a... Oh, God, I hate it when I do that. It's very boring. A little hanging Chad over there. Just, get rid of that. Okay. Silly sausage. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Go again. I think you must... too long a gap. That's the problem there. Crop that there. "I think you must know how I feel, even without me saying it out loud." Elizabeth sighed. "Even though I know it, I still am hopeful of him calling. Perhaps it will be best if he does not come to Hertfordshire." "Please don't say that," Elizabeth implored. "He wishes to be with his friend, and Colonel Fitzwilliam will be going too, and his young sister. She is very shy, and he wishes her to meet me again." Her aunt bent a stern eye on her. "Yes, that is something else I was surprised to hear about. Whatever possessed you to call on her, especially while she was staying at Matlock House?" Elizabeth tossed her head. "How else did you expect me to find out how Mr. Darcy was? We had been here for some weeks, and I could think of no way at all to discover whether he was recovering or not." "It obviously matters very much to you." Her aunt reached out and took her hand. "Lizzie, please try to guard your heart. I would not like you to break it when he marries another, as he must." She looked pensive. "And if you befriend his sister, you will still have to see him make his life with another, or cut her out of your life, which will do her no good if she is just... or cut her out of your... stomping on my cues. Or cut her out of your life, which will do her no good if she is as shy as you say." Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears. "I know what you're saying is what will be best for me, Aunt, but might we not talk of it longer? I would not wish Mr. Bingley or Jane to notice my feelings today. I am certain they will marry, and Mr. Darcy is a great friend of his, so I will always have to see him." "Oh, of course." Her aunt patted her hand. "We will continue another time, perhaps." She sat up straighter. "Have you and Jane arranged to begin to pack?" "Have you and... Oh, no, there's a bad punch back there. What's going on there? There. "Have you and Jane arranged to begin to pack your trunks this afternoon, or will you do it in the morning?" "We're not starting at dawn, are we?" Elizabeth asked. "I think if we do it tomorrow, I might persuade Jane to walk out with me this afternoon." "What a good idea." Her aunt looked pleased. "Perhaps I could come too and bring the children." "That would be fun." Elizabeth smiled. "I haven't seen so much of them as I would like to." "I think you've had a lot on your mind." Her aunt reached for her needlework. "Have you had any—" "Not any." "Have you had letters from home with any news I don't know about?" As her uncle's coach drew up outside Longbourn, Elizabeth was relieved to be home. At least with Jane and Uncle Gardiner there too, her aunt had not been able to speak to her about her feelings, and she had been glad of it. Would Mr. Darcy have been able to travel today with his relations and Mr. Bingley? She hoped he was improved enough. But if he wasn't recovered, part of her wanted him to stay in London under the expert care of the best surgeons. As she jumped down and greeted her family, she acknowledged that the larger part of her wanted him near. But she mustn't allow herself to feel that way. Her aunt's conversation had told her she had spent too long allowing herself to dream of impossible things. She must begin to detach herself from her thoughts. She must harden her heart and be happy for his recovery, and then let her feelings go. Wonderful it is. Wonderful as it was to dream of happiness with him, wonderful as it was to dream of happiness with him, it would only break her heart when they parted, as they must. And Aunt Gardiner was right, too, about not developing a too intimate friendship with Miss Darcy, although Elizabeth had not the first idea how she might prevent it. It had been obvious that the young girl had blossomed, even... It had been obvious that the young girl had blossomed under even the small contact they had had on her formal call. Elizabeth wondered how she had become so shy. Had she not had any opportunity for a real friendship to form with anyone before? She followed her family into Longbourn, glad to be home. Oh, that was me clicking my foot. Glad to be home. I don't like that. Go back a little. Keep my feet out of the way. She followed her family into Longbourn, glad to be home. She was happy with her life. Perhaps Miss Darcy had always been surrounded by paid servants, meeting only other young ladies like herself, those who had to remain formal or wished to be acquainted with her because their family wished to be aligned with hers. Elizabeth furrowed her brow. Was the elder brother married? If not, others might try to... If not, others might try and use his sister to ingratiate themselves with the family. She smiled as she took the familiar chair in the sitting room and listened to her mother's excited voice rising above the rest. It was good to be home, good to be back where expectations weren't too high and where no one was jostling for riches or social position. No, she must not give Mr. Darcy any encouragement. Okay. I think we can get another chapter in here. Have a wee sip. Yeah, we can get another chapter here. Big push, big Friday push. Okay, here we go. Oh, what happened there? Oh, I've just gone back to the wrong place, haven't I? 18, and we're on 24, so we've got a bit of a way to go. What was that? 23, so it's the end of this one. There we go. We're getting through it. We're getting through it. Here we go. Chapter 24. That's the one I just did. Stupid boy. Chapter 25 is the next one. There we go. Chapter 25. Darcy was utterly grateful to have finally begun the journey to Netherfield Park. He'd grumbled at the care his friend had taken to add extra cushions in the coach. He'd grumbled at the admonitions of the surgeon as he'd inspected. Had taken to add extra cushions in the coach. He'd grumbled at the admonitions of the surgeon as he'd inspected the seats, and he'd grumbled as he reluctantly submitted to wearing the sling under Richard's determined gaze. But he had flatly refused the But he had flatly refused the dose of laudanum the surgeon had wanted him to take before the start, And further, he had declined to carry any with him. Richard had reached out his hand. "I will carry the dose if you wish, Mr. Barry, and perhaps Darcy, but not Mr. Darcy. Let's go from Fitzwilliam. I will carry the dose if you wish, Mr. Barry, and perhaps Darcy will feel the benefit of it." "I will carry the dose if you wish, Mr. Barry, and perhaps Darcy will feel the benefit of it when he is tired enough." Darcy had scowled. The willow bark powders were bad enough, but he had to acknowledge they'd brought his fever down. Let's be about it. He'd have to be more careful of his temper once they had stopped for Georgiana to join them, but he wanted very much to encourage her friendship with Miss Elizabeth, and Christmas in the countryside would be a good place to nurture it. And Georgiana deserved his time and attention. And Georgiana deserved his time and attention. Their father was immersed in his own business, seeming to retreat from them with his own increasing age. Darcy frowned. Was his father dying? He wasn't at all sure whether things would improve once George inherited Pemberley. In fact, once his brother discovered the way the income from the estate had been secured, he'd be incensed. Darcy leaned back and closed his eyes. It would not be an easy time. He must recover and be well enough to protect his sister from the atmosphere. He must plan his own retirement and make a home for Georgiana. She was looking at him with an anxious expression as he stirred and groaned when the coach turned into a post stop to change the horses. "Are you unwell, William? Do we need to go back and see the surgeon?" He braced himself and sat up straighter. "No, Georgiana, do not be anxious. I am just a little stiff after having gone to sleep." He scowled at Richard and turned back to her. "We will have to converse. Oh, there's a bad punch there. Halfway through a breath. Let's get rid of it. "We will have to converse for the rest of the journey. If I am awake, I will be able to keep moving and be better by the next stop." She looked dubious, but smiled at him. "Are you going to get out and have a short walk round? Will that ease? Will that ease your stiffness?" He looked over at his friend. "What do you think, Bingley? Are you intending to stop for a while, or are you anxious to get to Netherfield?" Bingley shrugged. "I will do whatever you feel is best, Darcy." Richard intervened. "We'll stop for refreshments, perhaps. Georgiana may wish to retire for a moment, and you need to walk a few paces, Darcy." Darcy nodded rather unwillingly, but he knew his cousin was right. He walked beside him along the side of the village pond, Richard uncharacteristically quiet. It gave him time to think of Miss Elizabeth Bennet. He smiled to himself. He liked thinking of her as Elizabeth. If she'd been the eldest daughter, he'd only know her as Miss Bennet, and her forename would feel strange on his lips. Soon, he hoped, he might be able to call her Elizabeth, when he had made her an offer. Richard interrupted his thoughts. "So, we talked the other day, Darcy, about your infatuation with the Bennet girl. I am surprised you have come to Hertfordshire." He drew a deep breath. "Have you decided you will have her regardless of the concerns I related to you?" "I have." Darcy set his jaw. "I thank you for saying what you did that day. I am now forewarned about the opposition the family will put in my way when I proceed with my plan." He shrugged. "It might be that we will need to move far away, to be away from both George and those of my family who will disapprove of her." Richard chuckled. "Perhaps you will need to bury yourself in the Hertfordshire countryside, Darcy. She may wish to stay near her family." "Perhaps." Darcy thought he could bear even. Darcy thought he could bear even that. It might as well be before. It might be as well. It might be as well before Georgiana jumped on the queue. It might be as well before Georgiana has to do a season and be seen in society. He met Richard's gaze. You have seen how earnestly she wishes to be friends with Miss Elizabeth, and she will take her advice in confidence. It will assist her, not be a hindrance, as you thought. Richard shook his head. But Miss Elizabeth has never been to society balls. How can she help her? Darcy laughed, but it turned into a bark of discomfort. You have seen her appear at Matlock House uninvited, dressed as a country miss, and you said she was perfectly composed. Can you imagine her, properly dressed and calm, sweeping into a ball as a countess? He smiled, stifling his laugh. He smiled, stifling his laugh. She will be magnificent. Well, all I can do is wish you joy. Richard peered at him. I think you have made the right choice. He hesitated. Does she know you are in a position to offer her security? She might think you cannot make her an offer as an impecunious second son. Darcy blinked. I am not certain. He turned back towards the coach. He'd walked far enough. I might have been too thorough in my efforts to hide wealth from George. He glanced at his cousin. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. I will need to talk to her about the subject. Richard looked serious. As soon as you marry and resign your commission, he will know. What will you do? Darcy shook his head. I am not yet decided. But while I make plans, Elizabeth needs to know. She will not spread the news. He felt impatient. Let us continue our journey. At Netherfield, he had to summon all his strength to remain downstairs in the drawing-room, wishing rather that he might retire to his chamber and rest before he planned to go to Longbourn. But he could sense Georgiana was anxious, and he knew she found Miss Bingley rather overpowering, so he would stay with her. Richard fetched him a drink rather more palatable than tea, and he sat with them while he felt himself relax, thankful to be away from town and the whims of the prince. Miss Bingley leaned over him solicitously and touched his injured arm. He winced extravagantly. He certainly did not want Miss Bingley's attention. Oh, right, again, just double-check. Miss Bingley. Oh, that's right, she's got fluidity. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Darcy, she simpered. I forgot myself. Oh! She put her hand over her mouth in fake surprise. And I ought to call you Lord Falmouth. Falmouth. And I ought to call you Lord Falmouth. She smiled hungrily at him. We were all so delighted for you. The title could not have gone to anyone more worthy. If Darcy hadn't been so sickened, he might have laughed in her face. Surely she wasn't going to set her sights on him. Desperate for a title she might be, but she couldn't know he had a fortune of his own. Her £20,000 would not suffice for them. He suppressed a shudder. Georgiana leaned forward. I think I need to go to my chamber, William. I would like to have a rest before dinner. No one else could see her face, and she gave him a small smile, meaning she knew he could then make his own excuses too. He pushed himself to his feet. As you wish, Georgiana. He turned with frigid formality to their hostess. Miss Bingley, might you summon the housekeeper to show Georgiana to her chamber? Miss Bingley had been hanging on to every word he uttered, without, it appeared, understanding a word. Caroline! Bingley spoke sharply, and she seemed to recover herself. Of course, she purred and nodded at the footman. Richard had sized up the situation. You look as if you could do with a rest after the journey too, Darcy. Should we summon your servant? Darcy almost jumped at the opportunity. I had hoped we might make a call this afternoon. He looked pointedly at Bingley, who looked confused. Not if they're... Is that... No, I think it's Bingley. Yeah. Not if they have only just arrived, Darcy. I think tomorrow is the earliest we may justifiably attend. Darcy scowled. He really wanted to speak to Elizabeth. Richard's comment about her thinking Darcy might not be in a position to make her an offer had been eating at him. He urgently wished to see her. Then perhaps I might agree that your idea is a sound one, Richard. He tried not to sound too ungracious. Then I will have your servant summoned to attend you. Richard's eyes flashed a warning. Darcy didn't need it. He nodded slightly. He'd keep Maunder with him all the time he was not in company with the rest of the party. Miss Bingley had been just too obvious. Richard accompanied him. That was a bit... Yeah, okay. Miss Bingley had been just too obvious. Richard accompanied him. Richard had accompanied him to the foot of the stairs. "Be careful, Darcy. I must admit I had not considered you might, even without a fortune, be irresistible to ladies now you have a title. Miss Bingley will be desperate to ensnare you." He sighed, "especially once she realises you are paying attention to Miss Elizabeth." Darcy nodded gloomily. This period at Netherfield was not going to be as calm as he had hoped. Perhaps he could improve things somewhat sooner than he had thought by making an earlier offer to Miss Elizabeth. He smiled. He could plan what he was going to say. He knew from the look in her eyes when she talked to him that his wishes were mirrored by hers. He knew he would be the happiest of men. Okay, get this up for chapter 25. Chapter 25, and that is the end today because it's Friday and we have to be at a thing at 6 o'clock. It's 5:30 now for us. So that means that is the end of this week and our last session. These two will stay up till certainly Monday when the next sessions come out. Don't forget, if you've enjoyed it, like, subscribe, go tell your friends. After this, I believe we have a 3-book science fiction romance series. Not after this book, after this series. So there's another 2 books of Pride and Prejudice variations after this one we're currently narrating. And then it's off into science fiction romance. So we'll get all sorts of other people dropping in as well, which will be jolly good fun. If you are still here and you are looking for the box sets that we specialize in now for 1 credit, you can see those at longlistenlibrary.com. There's links to take you to all the Audible pages for them. Lots and lots of hours for just 1 credit. Yada, yada, yada. God, I hate the punting yourself out thing. I find it awkward. But there you go. I actually enjoy just the narrating. If I could pay somebody to be a PA to do all the... Yeah. Anyway, have a great weekend, and I will see any and all of you here on Monday. Take it easy. Bye now.